At our last Shadow Open Market Committee meeting in Washington, D.C. Last March, the whole panel, the whole symposium was all about the Fed's exit policies. And since then, we're 6 months further along in the Fed describing how it may exit, and then today's session, as a follow-up from the earlier presentations on central bank independence, are about issues critical to the Fed's successful exit policy. And I'd like to start out this session by asking Marvin Goodfriend a question. And it goes along the following lines. Yesterday, Federal Reserve Chairman Bernanke, in a Q&A session following his testimony to the House Financial Services Committee, stated, quote, "We would like to get back to an all-treasury portfolio within a certain amount of time." Okay, so Marvin, I'd like to ask you, when the Fed talks about the different tools it has available and the quote-unquote sequencing of its exit policy, what does all this mean, and what do you think is going to work and not work as the Fed exits?
Well, I think the exit strategy ought to have as its objective the Fed taking actions which pull back or recreate or restore in the public's mind the sense that the Fed is an independent institution, it is independent of the Congress, it is pushing back. I think the exit strategy, the essence of the exit strategy for me is not the mechanical details so much of when if the Fed exits its credit policies, although I think it should do that. I'm happy that they're doing that. The exit strategy is recreating a sense that the Fed will do what is necessary when the time comes to raise interest rates aggressively and stabilize inflation. The essence is pushing back against Congress, pushing back against political forces which are moving the Fed in the other direction. And they should take advantage of the opportunity before they really have to raise interest rates, which I don't think will happen for months and months, to make speeches that indicate to the public, to the markets, to New York City, the people that are pricing long-term securities, you can keep rates low because the Fed is going to push back and do its job. One of the reasons we're here in New York after 20 or how many, 30 years in Washington is because it's New York. It's the markets that are ultimately going to discipline the government. And this year we think a lot about how is government going to discipline the banks. The whole conversation is how the government has to somehow improve the regulation and the rules so that the banks can discipline themselves. I think there's something to that. But I think equally and possibly more important is how are the markets going to discipline the government? Markets, in my opinion, are where we have to hope ultimately for discipline to be exerted. And the Federal Reserve is the bridge between the politics and the markets. And the Fed, I think, should take advantage of the exit strategy to try to reconnect the markets to discipline the government. So the Fed has to move immediately on speeches to indicate it's with discipline. It and the markets are allies on this. And I think that's where we ought to go in practice before we move interest rates up.
I think the markets gave about 20 basis points worth of long-term information to the Fed, certainly on the front page of many newspapers in the last few days. I think that could also be extremely informative and in some ways help to guide the Fed to retake this mantle of leadership in its own independence. And that's certainly one of the positive takeaways from the current backup in rates in the last few days.
Okay, Charlie, when we think operationally, the Fed has talked about interest on reserves, reverse repo. Will those work to actually exit, to actually reduce the Fed's balance sheet and its exposure to GSEs? Or even if they do work, is that the right way for the Fed to be going about things?
There are lots of mechanical ways for the Fed to shrink its balance sheet. I was preparing a list as we were all discussing this topic last night. Of course, we could start off with raising reserve requirements. Not a good idea. We can talk about why it's not a good idea from a social welfare standpoint. Paying interest on reserves, of course, should be able to accomplish the result. To the extent that the Fed wants to keep has to keep its size of its balance sheet higher and wants to therefore limit the size of the money multiplier, paying interest on reserves should be an effective tool and probably can accomplish the whole objective. That can't necessarily be said for the reverse repo strategy because it's not absolutely clear that there'd be enough counterparties out there willing to deal with the Fed in that reverse repo strategy. There might be, but we just don't know. But of course, there's a final lever that we could use that I would like to sort of push on. Why is the Fed so worried about shrinking its balance sheet? Because of all these mortgage-backed securities that it's holding. In the spirit of Marvin's point, of the Fed's need to push back, to assert independence, to draw a line in the sand, and to give people confidence that the market has an ally, why not make a little bit of a stronger announcement than the chairman made yesterday? Make an announcement that says the following. There's already an institution out there, as many of us discussed last night, called Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And it is the public institution that has been given now the explicit fiscal role of holding these mortgage-backed securities. Therefore, we are planning to sell into the market hundreds of billions of dollars over the next 6 months in a predictable way, which we are sure Fannie and Freddie will be absorbing. And then let's see what that game of chicken results in. That, to me, would really shake things up. And I know it's very much consonant with what Marvin's been talking about. Announcing an inflation target, and the right one, a very low one, at the same time. So to me, it's not just the mechanical issues, Mickey, of the which of these things would work mechanically, but you have to accompany the right, an effective mechanical strategy with the strong signal that Marvin's talking about.
Can I follow up on that? I want to follow up because Charlie's point is very interesting. What it would do effectively is call the bluff of the fiscal authorities on whether or not these mortgage-backed securities are as good as treasuries. If they're as good as treasuries, then the Fed should sell them in order to shrink the balance sheet, as the Fed would ordinarily do to restrict or to bring back the reserves and raise interest rates, no problem. If they're not as good as treasuries, well, then the markets won't want them, and neither will Fannie and Freddie, because this will be a matter of politics. And the fact that the Fed is not doing this indicates to me that the Fed is part and parcel of playing this game. And that, in a nutshell, is why the public thinks the Fed is not fully independent.
Exactly right.
So I'm just restating what Charlie said so well, in fewer words.
That's about 2 hours of dinner last night.
That was after 11.